Oki, everyone. Welcome to our panel today. My name is Ikutsumi Beck. I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and I'm so happy today to be introducing everyone and starting out this panel on Spirit and LGBTQ resilience, the legacy and impacts of Indian boarding schools. This panel has been long in the making. We're extremely excited about all the panelists who are on here today. We're going to start off by doing some housekeeping. So just so you know, this is being recorded. This also being live streamed. If you registered, you're a participant, meaning that your video is not on. However, you can add things to the chat and add Q&As, questions to the Q&A section, which we will get to at the end. Today, we are going to open up with our land acknowledgement and some general information about this panel. And following this housekeeping section, we will have a short prayer. So if you would like to smudge during the prayer, please feel free to grab your smudge during this time. And so our land acknowledgement. In the state of Minnesota, multiple boarding schools have been identified where the children of 11 Minnesota tribes were forced to attend. Our office at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is based out of Minnesota, although many of our employees, staff, and coalition members are from all over the country and all over Turtle Island in general. So the purpose of these boarding schools was to strip away identity, to assimilate into the Christian faith, to disconnect them from their communities and families, and to forcibly steal land resources. The repercussions of these boarding schools are still prevalent to this day. So we would like to acknowledge that our office is located in Vide Ota Utunwe, or Many Lakes City, which is the ancestral land of the Dakota, who were forcibly removed by the federal government from this area, but who continue to make their homes and speak their language on these lands. We support the revitalization efforts of the Dakota language and 11 of the Minnesota tribes' well-being and sovereignty. We also acknowledge that this land became known as a home to the Anishinaabe people after their migration, and our office is located in what they call Kakabekong, or at the waterfalls, and that the Anishinaabe people continue to make their home and speak their languages on this land. We support the revitalization efforts of the Anishinaabe language and of all 11 of the Minnesota tribes' well-being and their sovereignty. Thank you so much. So one thing we would like to mention also before this, as a coalition, we've been doing a lot of different work around the country. And one of the things that we've been involved in is the establishment of a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools. Right now, we have 2 bills, one in the House, one in the Senate, to get this boarding school bill passed. And we just wanted to inform you that written testimony is being accepted by the Senate Indian Affairs Committee until July 22nd, and we will be dropping into the chat information about that later. You can also find it on our Facebook page. At the end of this webinar, at the end of this panel, we're going to have a raffle for some NABS swag. So if you want to be included in that raffle, you have to attend until the end. And for those on Facebook, we apologize. It's just for the Zoom attendees. So I am going to briefly provide a prayer, and then I'm going to introduce Candi Brings Plenty. And this prayer is one that was provided to me by Leonard Weasel Traveler via a class that I took from the Blackfeet Community College that they had during the pandemic. They did one that was virtual. It was really amazing. And so we just want to start this out in a good way. So that's why we're having a prayer, and why we usually have some sort of song or prayer at the beginning of all of our events. We think that this is very important for setting the tone for how sacred this work is of healing from Indian boarding school trauma. So, Eo Nina, Eo Ixipatipiopa, Spomochke, Nochgenochke, Isopomakanan, Nakohkits, Si Xiskatopanan, Sapomapi, Eo, Natoi, Kokomikisum Episuas, Noxpomohkenan, Skach Kohmitapi, Natusi, Noxpomokenan, Napiosin, Ach Se Doa Siman, Misame Be Isin, Gamotan. Hanya. Thank you. And so next I would like to introduce Candi Brings Plenty. Candi is Oglala Lakota and is also the main organizer, Indigenous justice organizer for the ACLU of South Dakota. Candi works to build the ACLU's public education and advocacy programs through coalition building, leadership development, communication, and lobbying. She leads the efforts surrounding the ACLU's No KXL, No DAPL, MMIW, and Two Spirit visibility work. She is also the organizer for all West River ACLU campaigns in South Dakota. And I've had the pleasure of working with Candi in various situations. And, you know, they're also a big activist in the healing from boarding school trauma world. So welcome, Candi. Take it away.
I'm Betty Lashday. I'm going to offer a traditional introduction for myself, and then I will translate it into English. Hemadak yapi, leampe tukile, iyo hachande, washde nape chuziapi. Imachiapi wakia tuampi iyo yampawi. Imachiapi chante makilawi. Mi washichu chajekile Candi Brings Plenty. Imataha na hecha ochatu shakoi. Imataha na chisapa mini luzaha kile. I'd like to greet each and every one of you with a handshake from my heart. My Lakota names are Bright Lightning Woman and Woman Close to My Heart. And I am here in the Ochaktushakoi territory in the Sacred Black Hills in Rapid City, South Dakota. And I'm an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and I come from the Pine Ridge Reservation. You know, I am so elated. I don't have the words to really convey you know, how to express, because I feel both excitement that there is a narrative that is finally being shared from a two-spirit perspective on how boarding schools have impacted them. I myself am a product of the boarding school era, as both of my parents were survivors. And, you know, before there was this movement, before there was even anything in a common acknowledgement that, you know, that these boarding schools have impacted our lives the way they have, I grew up with stories from my parents, and I didn't understand, you know, the historical trauma, and, you know, just even understanding why they were telling me these stories growing up. Even since I was little, I remember my parents, you know, they would tell me things, and I think it was them just releasing and not understanding themselves that, you know, they were practicing or they were implementing this intergenerational trauma transition, because all those stories went into my body, they went into my being. And it really wasn't until I started working for the SAMHSA. I was a fellow with the SAMHSA Fellowship, and I did research on historical trauma, and I created a healing tool for students so that they could recognize it, because it really impacted me. And it was like a light turned on. I started to understand my parents' mannerisms and why and when they were getting triggered. And I was able to trauma map for myself. And that's something I teach my children as well. But, you know, to understand and to hear these stories, once I came out as two-spirit to my parents, they started telling me stories of other two-spirits that they realized went through another horrific, you know, just a whole background that hasn't been spoken about. And I do a lot of mentorship. I work with the Indigenous Intertribal Indigenous Youth Council, and I've been mentoring them on how to organize and how to step up and how to really take back some of that medicine that was stolen from our great grandparents and our parents in the boarding school. So I just wanted to share a little bit about my passion about why this webinar itself is so important and so vital, and how I myself have been impacted. But Wopila Tonka NABS, the Native American Boarding School Coalition, for being so open and, without hesitation, definitely wanted to elevate the stories and wanted to open this opportunity to see that there is a wide spectrum of healing that needs to be done. And just by acknowledging Two Spirits have their own trauma from the boarding school era is humongous and is a healing in its own. So I would like to definitely turn it over and let the other panelists introduce themselves. Maybe we can start with Landa.
So Chipawat Mingo Thomas Aminti Tupelo Chickasaw. I'm also known as Migo Thomas. My name is Landa Lakes, and I am Chickasaw, and I'm originally from the Chickasaw community in Oklahoma. And I don't know what else you really want to know, other than, right now I live in San Francisco, which is on the land of the Ohlone people. And I guess I'll pass it on to Sadé to introduce herself.
Kwe, Teluisi Wikamalaman Papukwis. Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Heart of the Hawk. I am Mi'kmaq First Nation from Nova Scotia, what's now known as Nova Scotia, Canada, living on the unceded territory of the Quinnipiac in North Haven. I am what is termed a first-generation survivor of the residential school, which is what they were called on my side of that artificial border in Mi'kmaq, what is now known as Nova Scotia and the Maritime Provinces, the land of the Mi'kmaq. And I'm living and working and playing and enjoying my life, living my life now on the land of the Quinnipiac people in what is now known as North Haven, Connecticut. Pass it on to Lenny.
And Namaste, everyone. I am, I always like to introduce myself also with my Indian name. My Indian name is Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes, and I'm from the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. And the reason why I said good morning is because I'm currently in Seattle and it's still morning here, but it's so good to see everyone. I'm also excited that we're having this conversation today, because often we know that the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ population is often forgotten in many, many different areas. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. Thank you, Landa. Thank you, Sadé. I also want to excuse myself. I did not share my pronouns, and I use they, them, theirs. I'm also open to she, her, hers. I definitely respect my matriarch roles. And I definitely want to get this panel rolling. So I'm going to just ask the first question and we can go in any order, but our first question definitely is, tell us how you have been impacted, or what your relationship is to healing from the boarding school era.
Well, I guess I can sort of jump in here. I guess you could say that I come from a long line of people who went to boarding school, as well as going to boarding school myself. So, it started way back with Bernie Academy in Oklahoma back during my great-grandfather's time. And then it moved on to Bloomfield Seminary for my grandmother. And then for my father, it was Sequoia Indian Boarding School in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And for me, I attended Jones Academy, which was in Hartshorn, Oklahoma, as well as.
Can you speak up, Landa? We have some folks who are having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, I'm gonna try to speak up louder. Um,
Thank you.
Let me see, where was I? So yeah, so I attended Jones Academy in Hartshorn, Oklahoma, as well as Carter Seminary in Ardmore, Oklahoma. So you could say that, you know, my family attended boarding school for what seems like forever, since even before statehood and in 1907 in Oklahoma.
Thank you, Landa. I think a lot of folks don't realize too, you know, some of these boarding schools that are still functioning today, they still definitely practice a lot of that repetism that our great grandfathers and grandmothers and our parents went through. I definitely went to boarding school as well, so I know that that still trickled down. Thank you for that. Lenny or Sadé?
I was deeply impacted by the residential schools and that era. My mother, who was an registered member of the Pictou Landing Reserve in Nova Scotia, was taken by force at around the age of 5, and Pictou Landing and the surrounding reserves had the name of the residential school was Shubenacadie. It opened in the mid 1920s, and she was forcibly taken there when she was about 5 years old. She spent 10 years there, came out not knowing how to read or write. She knew how to iron a shirt and how to wash clothes, and she knew how to hate herself. One of the greatest impacts on me, on my life, was that my entire childhood, I grew up not knowing anything about who my mother was. I didn't understand her treatment. I didn't understand the violence. I didn't understand the lack of love, the lack of affection. I didn't understand why I could not know who she was. And I had heard her and who I thought was my grandmother, later to find out that she was the woman who adopted my mother out of the residential school, and she was basically her maid, this woman's maid. I thought she was my grandmother. There were many, many, many secrets in my family, and I grew up under this veil of abuse and this veil of everything that happened to my mother in the residential school. And I only found out through an auntie when I was a grown woman. Everything that happened to her happened to me. And so I lived in this artificial world of abuse, and talk about adverse childhood experiences. I was a 9 out of 10 on that scale. And so the amount of trauma that was visited on me that she passed down, and children learn what they live. And I had to forgive my mother later on in life, but everything that happened to her, she thought was okay. And so it was okay for it to happen to me. But there was a tremendous amount of healing that I had to do, a tremendous amount of recovery. And I grew up thinking I was the only one in the world that these horrible things were happening to. And it wasn't until I sat in a healing lodge in New Brunswick, Canada, having a terrible challenge with opiates, did I hear my story told around that sacred circle at least 15 times. So we have a lot of healing to do.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Sadé. I know that a lot of times whenever we do these webinars, we try to be, real direct. And this is something that is highly sensitive. So I want to acknowledge all of you for, being very public right now, and allowing yourself to share these stories and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. So I really appreciate the prayer at the beginning. And I'm very excited to continue this narrative for other folks who haven't even open their spectrum to think about the impact of gender, the impact of sexuality, the impact of orientation, and, you know, just even the own impact of two spirits. But definitely, we'd like to hear from you, Lenny.
Sure. Well, not only do I call myself a survivor of the boarding school era, I also call myself a person who is also a survivor of the foster care system. Before I went to boarding school, I experienced a lot of that foster care. And one of the things that happened was when I was 10 years old, my mother lost her parental rights. And at someone at 10 years old, and it's really difficult just today just to talk about, you know, just recently the woman who was my social worker 40 years ago, who sat with me when this was happening. And, you know, I came from a home where there was a lot of abuse. There was a lot of sexual assaults happening. My father wasn't in the picture, but there was just so much violence as a child. And one of the things, and the reason why it's difficult sort of to talk about this part of it is because this woman who was with me 43 years ago in the courtroom just recently passed away. And she's a woman who, what I remember about that time when my mother lost her parental rights was her trying to comfort me and to help me to understand what was going on, because I didn't know what was going on. And I kept asking, what does that mean? What does that mean? And what I remember the most is her just telling me in a very simple way, well, your mom has no legal rights over you, meaning that she can't make decisions for you. And so then becoming a full-fledged foster care person or a child, I was forced to go to a boarding school in North Dakota. And my experience there was that the people who took care of me were the ones, they were actually good to me, but it's what the other children did. I was gang raped at the age of 10 years old by 3 older boys. I remember always running away from the boarding school. And I grew up knowing at a very young age that I was different, put it that way. But no one taught me about my identity. And I really didn't learn the two-spirit identity until almost, 25 years ago when I first came to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I heard the term two-spirit, and that's where I connected. So that's why it's always important for me when I do this work, also when I do child welfare work, is that understanding that we as Native people are failing our children. We're failing them because we're not teaching them the beauty and balance of what it means to be two-spirit, but also just to remember that, you know, the term two-spirit is a fairly new word that just came about in 1990. But our people, our tribes had a specific word that identified us. And because of the impact of historical intergenerational trauma on this community, that word is gone. In a lot of tribal communities, because, you know, I do a lot of trainings across Indian country, and I will ask people, do you know the word in your language? And a lot of them don't. So, you know, like Sadé, I mean, I went through 10 years of extensive healing. And the thing that I always take honor in is that when I first went into ceremony, the person who took me into my first sweat lodge was a Dakota two-spirit woman. And she taught me how to pray. She taught me how to carry those rocks. She taught me how to tend to the sweat lodge. So those were amazing things. And that was at the beginning of my healing. So thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. You know, that's part of definitely healing, is just being able to share your story and being able to connect. Like I said, I call it trauma mapping. It's something that I just, you know, shared with my children, and now I'm teaching my own siblings why our father had those mannerisms. And it was definitely like a light bulb that went on, especially now that my younger brothers are having children. Parenting has always been a topic of turmoil, because I think a lot of us didn't realize our parents had no parenting skills, you know, and definitely they were taught military tactics into altering the being that they came in as. And so I know, you know, just hearing these stories, I think all of you are so courageous, because I know it's taken years of healing to just be able to share your stories, to be confident enough to turn that into medicine for other people to hear it and heal from it. So thank you so much, Lenny. My next question is something that I have very much been working towards and advocating about when I speak, and that is about how the boarding schools have impacted what it looks like and sounds like and feels like to have gender, you know, completely colonized, even through our own parents and grandparents' perspectives and worldviews. But also, you know, how has that created a community understanding our misunderstanding of gender roles and sexuality?
Well,
you know, go ahead.
if I can go into this, well, I know that as a child, what stood out to me the most was, you know, my father was constantly trying to make me tough, trying to make sure that I was tough and I was strong. And this all comes from his time at boarding school, because, you know, when you're in boarding school, you're going to have to fight. If you don't fight, everyone's going to go after you. Even people younger than you will start going after you, because that's just how it's set up in boarding schools. So from the youngest that I could remember, my father was always trying to toughen me up. But as a child, you don't really understand that. You just think, why is my dad always being mean to me? And that's sort of how I grew up, thinking my dad was, like, you know, really mean to me, and, you know, constantly making me fight, constantly buying boxing gloves so that I could fight with my cousins. And so I didn't really understand it until I was actually in boarding school. And once I was there, I realized that, you know, you had to fight and you had to keep fighting. And then the people that were like, I don't know, the people who were unbothered by it were those really tough boys, you know, the ones who were really tough, and, you know, they got really tight with the people who were the administrators and everything else, because they really loved the tough kids too. So if you were a very femme boy going into boarding school, you had to be very careful, because you would definitely get the brunt of everything. And it's not just them, but also we used to have this thing called a matron. And so she was sort of like the hall mother or something. And if you were a little femme too, she was mean to you as well. So there was a lot of stuff going in about, you know, these gender identities. And, you know, for the most part, the boarding schools I attended, you know, at one time they were very segregated. Like, for instance, you know, they started as a girls' school, then they added boys, and there was always that division that sort of remained. Even though they took less things on the domestic pieces of it, they still expected girls to do certain things and boys to do certain things. And so I think that gender identity that started from like the 1800s just remained and stayed in effect, that was brought in by so many of those missionaries that brought it. And it's unfortunate that it affected all the children who are in those boarding schools, as well as those people who are administering them, which to me is the worst part. I just always like to think, you know, I always want to think, oh, these are good people here. But it's hard for me, because sometimes when I think about it, I'm like, why was she so mean? Why was he so mean? Why were they mean to us? You know, we were not their children. Why do they have to be so mean? And so I think that's all that I'll say on that.
Well, I just wanted to say too, I mean, just listening to Landa's story, I mean, my own biological father was very mean to me also, because, you know, both my parents knew that I was different. And one certain story that always stays with me, but I've healed from it, and I've learned to forgive the people who hurt me. And it wasn't about them, it was about me, to help me to continue my healing. But I always tell the story of my dad becoming very violent. And he had one of those, you know, those steel balls with the chain. And I remember him saying to me, swinging it in a circle in front of me and saying, "I'm going to knock the gay out of you." And it went through the wall. And I remember my grandmother, his mother, yelling at him, saying, "Why are you doing that to him?" And again, you know, nobody ever taught me these things about my identity. And my mother, you know, my biological mother, did horrific things to me as a child. Often would put me out in a dress and have me sit in the middle of the yard, and would allow the boys, the neighborhood boys, to taunt me. And again, never taught me about who I was. And so I went through, at a very young age, just very confused about my identity. And so, you know, I knew I was different, but nobody told me. And that's why I think, you know, it's very important that we help our young children that come out, to help them understand their identity. Doesn't mean that we have to, you know, sort of force them to do things, but explore with them and allow them to explore. One of the things I always say too is that, you know, currently for me, I don't use pronouns. And I'm respectful to the people who want to use them, but I don't use pronouns because I believe it's a form of colonization. Meaning that when pronouns came about, a brown person like us was probably not invited to the table to have that deep understanding and that conversation with them. That because in a lot of our tribes across Indian country, there's languages that don't have a word for gender. And so again, I feel that we are being, for me, I'm being forced to do something that just doesn't fit who I am. And really that understanding that even before colonization, we didn't have a word for lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in our tribal languages. There was a specific word. And just really understanding how that intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, has really impacted our people and our understandings.
Thank you, Lenny.
Yeah, I see, sadly, I see the impact of the residential school, boarding school era in my work across Turtle Island. And I get the honor and privilege of working with our nations to mitigate the impact of suicide in our communities. Sadly, for those of you who are Indigenous, we have amongst our children the highest rates of suicide across cultures. And our children are 4 times more likely to end their lives than any other cultural group. What is not talked about, though, is that many of these children who are ending their lives are either Two-Spirit or identify as LGBT. And it has nothing to do with gender dysphoria. It has nothing to do with challenges with their sexual orientation. It has to do with the impact of colonization and the impact of these residential schools, of these boarding schools, where it was militarized, where you had to be a man or you had to be a woman, and there was nothing that the children who came in as Two-Spirit. And I have something I want to share in this particular space. Who were accepted, who were honored, who were revered in their nations, coming into these artificial, they weren't schools. Let's not call them schools. They were not schools. They were not places of learning. Some of them might have been, but many were not. They were prisons where our children, some as young as 3, were taken and brutalized and returned to the community in pieces, many of them. Many, not all, but many. And so I see the impact of this colonization. And I'm kind of with Lenny. In my language, there is no word. There are no pronouns. There are no he, she, they. So my act of decolonization or decolonizing myself is to use the pronoun they. And I use this in my work. This is my Zoom account, and this is how what is on my Zoom account when you have a Zoom meeting with me. But I used to be so angry with our nations where I go and I cannot even mention, I'm told not to mention the term two-spirit. And I'm not going to tell you which nations these are. However, there's a number of them who refuse to allow that conversation to happen. And I used to be so angry and upset until I realized where the blame really lies. And that's in those boarding schools, in those residential schools, where our children, and if you tell a child something often enough, they internalize it. So if you tell them there's something wrong with them for being Indigenous, which they all were told, and then you tell them on top of it, there's something very wrong with these children. These children are demonic. There's something really wrong with them, and you need to act like that towards them. You need to keep this in their mind, and every chance you get to let them know that there's something really wrong with them. And so our children internalized all this, went back to the nations, and continued to carry on this. And this is why we have nations, I believe, that you cannot talk about being two-spirit. You cannot, people are still in 2022 forced to come out of a circle, a sacred circle, because the powwow committee thinks they're in the wrong regalia. Or you have the sweetheart dancers who were not allowed to compete, or who were thrown out of Gathering of Nations because they didn't fit the mold of what a couple was. So, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit, this is very in my heart for me. So, I think we need to put the blame where it belongs, and not on our children who were forced to endure this horrific treatment, but on these systems, on these religious systems who not only brainwashed our children, but who also in terms of other things abused them so horrifically that, we're still healing. It's going to take 7 generations, let's just be honest. But I think, having this conversation, and we're still in Canada, we're still trying to get the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to pay attention to the two-spirit experience in the boarding schools. There's a few stories, but not enough. And so I think having this conversation really puts us ahead of the curve, because we haven't seen the entire impact of the trauma from what the Department of the Interior is going to be doing to identify more of our babies.
Well, Bilatanka, thank you so much, Sadé. And I just want to say, do not apologize, be unapologetic, because this needs to be heard, and that's what this space is for. And, I appreciate your fire, absolutely. And, that definitely does, take us to our next question that is very much related to what you're talking about. And, my next question is, there are many misconceptions about two-spirits and LGBTQ plus folks. Can you talk about the misconceptions and their impacts?
Yes, I love this question. The thing that I always tell people, because I do go across Indian country and do trainings on the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma on this population, one of the things that I talk about first is that the term two-spirit is a universal term, and it's used across Indian country, but we must remember that in some tribal communities, the people who identify do not call themselves two-spirit because it doesn't fit within their culture or their beliefs. And so what we need to stop doing is assuming or knowing that someone who may identify, we need to stop calling them two-spirit. What we need to simply do is ask them, how do you identify? Because again, when we do that, what we're doing is we're giving them their power to identify who they are. So again, like for me, what I always say to people is that I will identify as a Winkta first, because that's the word that was given to me by my people. Even though I grew up with that term used against me in a derogatory way, which brought a lot of shame in who I am, and through my own personal healing, I am taking that word back. So I always say I call myself a Winkta first, and then I call myself a Two-Spirit, and then I call myself a gay male. That's my way of decolonizing my way of thinking. And then just truly understanding, you know, my identity as a Winkta and the role that I play in community, not only in my own tribal community, but also in my community as someone who does identify as a Two-Spirit. So.
Well, one of the misconceptions that I think that that exists within the LGBTQ community. Sometimes that community believes that because, you know, Two-Spirit people were honored in the past, that they're honored now, and that's not the case in most tribes. In most tribes that have been very Christianized, it's just the opposite. A lot of times they'll say, well, you know, this never existed in our communities or our stories. And it forces a person to actually go back and look it up and actually find that there are stories from within your own tribe that does exist. So I would say that that's one of the biggest misconceptions by the LGBT community when they look at Two-Spirits, is they think that somehow there is an honorific role that Two-Spirits people play today. And it's not, because in a lot of communities, we're just fighting for that equality. And even in my own tribe, I know that I've seen several Two-Spirit people that have been honored in our tribal paper, the Chickasaw Times. I'll get that and I'll recognize them. And of course, there's nothing in it about their LGBTness or anything else. That's just sort of left out. I just saw the other day one person was honored as honored, and I know about their work within the Two-Spirit community, and that was just sort of like not even mentioned. It was just shined over. And so when you're dealing with tribes that are so Christianized, it is sometimes our own selves that have to really push ourselves out there even further than we really want to sometimes, to make sure that Two-Spirit are known, and that it's not just us, but that we have a whole history of it. And I think that's very important for us to change that misconception, so that people know that, yes, people like us have always existed within our tribal communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Landa. I want to share this with the group to kind of put a fine point on the fact that, you know, there are still stories about how Two-Spirit people were seen as a special gift from Creator to the nations. And this came from a phone call I had with my Auntie Mary Augustine, and she's presently in a hospice right now. She's 96, but she is from Bugnagek First Nation, Mi'kmaq First Nation, and she's a survivor of the Shubenacadie Residential School in Nova Scotia. So she says, I was in Shuby with your mother, Marie. We were there the same time. Your mother would have been my age if she was still on this side. I remember that her birthday was on the same day as mine. I'm sorry to hear that she walked on. I don't like to talk about those things. I try to forget as much as possible. They were very bad times, and bad things happened to all of us there at that place. Many of us were from the areas around that place, so many of us spoke Mi'kmaq, but we had our mouths washed out with lye soap, or they beat us bad if they heard us talk. So we would try to sneak and talk Mi'kmaq together. I don't know what Two-Spirit is, not in the way you're using it, but there were children in our community who fit the description you gave me. But we didn't know that until they took us away to residential school. I don't remember if the elders even had a special name for those children. We didn't treat them any different than we did any other Mi'kmaq, except that the elders seemed to always want them close. We didn't even know they were different until we got to residential school. When we would do our ceremonies for the changing of the seasons, they were always close to the old ones. I remember two of our community whom my grand always told me that Creator had special jobs for them. That's what they told us. The agents took my brother and me after threatening my parents to put them in prison if they didn't let me and John go to school. I found out later that they had taken 6 of us in the community. One of the children we're talking about was in the group too. We always saw this child in clothes us girls wore, so we always thought she was a girl. When we got to Shuby, they made us take off all our clothes, girls in one room, boys in the other, and they made us wash in tubs with lye soap and cold water. I remember the nuns being upset because this little girl was really a boy, and they called to the priest to come and get him. I remember them coming for him and then hearing him cry. We were all about 5 or 6. That was the first beating we heard, but there were many more. I remember that every day the priests and nuns would make that child stand in the front of the room where we ate the mush they gave us to eat every morning. And they would make fun of this child and would push him around and slap him and call him names. When we first got there, we all spoke only Mi'kmaq, or the language we had when they were taken from our people. So we didn't understand, but we were children and we learned very quickly. They would tell us to laugh at him and to call him names too. They even told us that we should hit him when we passed him. Most of us were so frightened that we did as we were told. Pretty soon, we began to believe that there was something very wrong with these children because that's what the priests and nuns told us every day. And we kept up the abuse even when the priests and nuns weren't there. There were always a few who were receiving this kind of abuse throughout our entire time there. It makes me sad even now to know that we were part of that. They taught us to hate ourselves, but they taught us to hate these children even more. And she ended by saying, I can't talk about this anymore. This was many years after her experience in Shubenacadie, but it still stayed in her heart, and she was still saddened by the treatment of these children that were just part of the community that the elders wanted close. And I think that, there were many of our nations, like Lenny said, not all of our nations have or had a concept of Two-Spirit, but for those who did, there are stories about the sacredness of Two-Spirit people, our ability to not only walk in male and female, but walk in physical and spiritual. Many of our nations were afraid of us because they thought our medicine was very strong, because we were said to be able to see from here and not just from here. So I've seen places all over Turtle Island where our Two-Spirit people are honored. It's usually the more traditional the nations are, the more honored we seem to be. And we're trying very hard to return to that sacred space because our children are dying. We need to do something. We need to reach out. We need to wrap our arms around them and say it's okay. And I want to honor my own ancestors, all of the Bernards and the Pauls and Gabe Hood and all of those ancestors who came before me, especially my Two-Spirit ancestors who are guiding this conversation today. Make no mistake.
Thank you so much. That was very in depth in a beautiful way, where folks get to feel and see and get just a portion of what Two Spirits might have gone through or what they did go through. Stories are so important, and I'm looking forward to also a few more questions that I have here, just from the past few moments of feeling what that story did to me. Can you share a little bit more? I want to hear where it was this a letter that you just read, or was this something? I think I missed that, but can you share a little bit more about it?
A few pieces for a newsletter supporting Two-Spirit people, especially Two-Spirit children. And I was asked if I knew anything about the treatment of our Two-Spirit people in the residential schools. And of course, I had seen Laurie McDonald's video, and I've seen Mani Chakabi's videos, and there are only a few stories in the Truth and Reconciliation report. But I said, you know what? I have an auntie who I know was in the residential school with my mother. Let me see if I can get her. And so I called my cousin and asked her if she could get auntie together and have some smudge ready, because I wanted to ask her some questions. So really, this was a telephone conversation that I had with my auntie, and she shared this story with me about these children that were in the community, were seen as part of the community, were seen as special, as having like she said, her grand told her that Creator had a special role for these children. And I would always see them by the elders, you know, she said I didn't know why. They were just kids. They were just Mi'kmaq children, and we didn't treat them any different except the elders did. And so this was a conversation I had on the phone with my auntie, and she ended up, my cousin had to smudge her because the memory was so powerful for her.
Did we get to hear from Landa or Lenny on this question? Or do we still need to? I'm sorry.
I think I was last.
Okay. I want to also give a little bit of my insight. I do feel called to share a little bit from, you know, it was really amazing to have an event this past fall at the Holy Rosary Mission, where my parents, my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and myself attended school. And, you know, it definitely is a boarding school that ravished our community on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And now it's called Red Cloud High School. But we had an event, and we got to elevate our elders to share their stories. And we got to bring the Horse Nation, and we went directly onto their campus, and we were able to speak and give space to these elders to speak directly to these Jesuits. And you know, one component was I got to speak on behalf of being a mentor to the group who was leading this event, the Indigenous Youth Council, the Oglala chapter. And you know, I was recalling a story my father had told me, and he said every time we would run away and they would find us, he would tell me there was this one specific nun, and he said I never understood why it was a nun, you know, and not one of the Jesuits who showered us after we were caught, you know. And he said she focused very much and would tell them how dirty they were. And you know, he told me this is where that sexual abuse started, was, you know, she would use a still wool scrubber and scrub their genitals until they bled, you know, just to remind them, you know, just a form of torture. And, you know, it was always the same nun because this was her job, I guess. I don't know. But, you know, my father was saying sometimes it wasn't just sexual abuse, it was torture. You know, they knew how to torture these children before they even understood their own identities of gender and orientation. And he told me, he said, you know, when I came up to him, he shared his story with me about how he was worried that, you know, I was going through a custody battle, and my girls were only 3 and 4 at the time. And he said, there's no protections for you as a parent, and, you know, as a Two-Spirit parent. And he said, and you know, that the court systems, especially the tribal court systems, there is no advocacy for Two-Spirit people. And, you know, he started to tell me, he said, there's a lot of elders who forgot the sacred ways of Two-Spirit people. So I thank you for highlighting that. And he said, in my language, he said, you need to say Hechiel Matumpi. And that means I came across the Star Nation this way. I came through the Milky Way like this. And so, people kind of translate that to I was born like this. And, he said, because they lost their language, the language is connected to the culture and to our protocols and our ceremonies. And, he also very much highlighted the fact that it was the boarding schools that taught them sexual abuse. And it was the boarding school, the Jesuits, who were taking these boys in the middle of the night. And, he told me, he said, but yet they would beat and kill, beat them to death, those who were very mild-mannered and who seemed to be feminine. And I understand, that's where that masculine component of trying to be tough and be mean, and he said, we couldn't understand it. He said, but we learned through fear tactics that if you're feminine or if you, and he said, but we knew a lot of those boys were raised by their grandparents. And so they were very tender and very loving and very affectionate. And they had a demeanor of them as an elder. And, he said, and it took him, I think this conversation was him understanding and coming to his own reckoning of what the boarding school did and the contribution they played to homophobia. And, he said, we were fearful and we had to show them, how masculine we were. And he said, and part of that turmoil and that rage towards homophobia that a lot of people and transphobia that a lot of people have has been built in a combination of that fear of being the next kid to be tortured or tormented by a same gender person. And so, he really deconstructed this misconception of gender and orientation and where it came from. And he said, when I really take the time to think about, how much hate there is out there, a lot of it was perpetuated by how did he say, excuse me, the tendencies of these Jesuits who were torturing people. So I just really wanted to lay that down because I think a lot of people, I was raised hearing my mom say, oh, that person is gay because something happened to them when they were little. I remember hearing that and I never understood what that meant. Something happened to them, and I think through my mom's generation, they continue to carry that fear and that, because it was my mother who was more resistant to accepting me as a two-spirit. And my father was very wide open in my support from the beginning. And I think that's definitely what pushed me to start advocating to, hearing the stories and highlighting how two-spirit people and how homophobia and transphobia was very much insinuated by the boarding schools themselves, and I want to transition to this next question. And, initially there was this saying of the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And then that evolved to the boarding school concept of kill the Indian, save the man. And, that's exactly what the intentions of the boarding schools were. And I'm very grateful, that all of you have spoken very intentional through your lived experiences. And I think that, for now, I would really like to hear with this next question is asking, part of the legacy of the boarding schools was to take away your Indianness, make you feel shame. How have you done, what have you done to bring back the culture pride and culture of self-love?
That's a really deep question. I think that growing up, I would have to say that I've always been somewhat oppositional. So keep telling me that I should live in shame. I'm not going to. It's just the way it is. I think that one of the things that I did was, like, there was a time in my life for a while where I did not get involved in a lot of Native things because I always felt excluded or pushed out of things. So there was a period in my time that I was sort of away from it, and then it made me mad. I got angry that, you know, I was being pushed out, you know, just because of my queerness. And so I guess you could say that I came back somewhat with a vengeance, because I'm like, no, this is not right. I'm not going to be pushed out. I'm going to make myself known, you know. And this is also one of the reasons why, you know, we at the Bay Area American Indian Two Spirits Bates, we started that Two Spirit powwow, was just that feeling of being excluded from our own culture, that we wanted to make sure that, you know, other people didn't feel that same way. So when we created that powwow, it was all about, you know, being able to say, hey, I'm Indigenous, I'm proud, I'm a part of this community, I've always been a part of this community, I'm not leaving this community. And so that was sort of our way of starting like this big, I don't know, shining light or something on our own community. And I feel so blessed to have seen Two Spirit powwows start up in other parts of, you know, Canada and the United States. It's been such a blessing. And I always think back to many years ago when I attended Red Earth in Oklahoma with one of my best friends, Russell Big Horse, as we were walking through there, how so many people, you know, sort of looked down on us, made fun of us. I mean, they didn't turn us away at the 49, but they certainly didn't make us feel welcome at the powwow. And so now, all these years later, I just think to myself, how wonderful it would have been if Russell had survived and been able to come to our powwow. You know, you can try to make me feel shame, but I'm not going to, because I know that we have a rich history. And as the First Peoples here, it's important that that we put not only our people's place where it is, but also who we are as Two Spirit people, having existed within our communities. It's important that other people know that, you know, what's that saying, that don't let other people run over you. And that's exactly what happens sometimes in tribal communities. They will run over you, and they'll make you believe certain things about, you know, about yourself and about their community. But it's important that you remember who you are, and remember that you're human. And we always greet each other with this word in Chickasaw. We say chukma, which means to be good. And I think it's important that that we continue to use that even with people that we don't like, because of the fact that it humanizes us and reminds other people that I see you as human, see me as human.
Yes, love that. You know, going back to the other question, because I really wanted to mention something, but you know, I've done a lot of trainings specifically for upcoming social workers, mental health providers, and have been invited to universities to do these things. And I remember one time when I was talking about the historical impact of on this on our community, and I was talking about the nuns and priests, and I had this Hispanic woman stand up. She was a student, and she said, please don't talk about them like that, because they're not all bad. Because I was talking about the priests and nuns and what they did to our children. And so I responded very nicely. I said to her, that's your story. This is our story. Which was a sense very powerful, because it just came out. Because I know that a lot of our people, a lot of different communities are very protective when it comes to the nuns and priests. And you know, even my own family, some of my siblings are very connected to the church. And I've had to say to them, I respect the way you believe, please respect the way I believe. Because, you know, again, I mean, just that deep understanding, you know, I don't call myself, I'm not a part of that, you know, and I don't want to be a part of that. You know, the thing for me is that it took a lot of healing to get where I'm at, because there was so much shame of who I was. And through that healing and being connected to culture and spirituality really helped me to really truly understand my role as a Two-Spirit person. and understanding that my role is to continue to help my community, but also help my people in the work that I do in a professional manner, which is a mental and chemical health therapist. Because for us, often sometimes our community is very standoffish in wanting to receive the healing that most often a lot of us need, because of we're always being judged about who we are. The thing that I always remind people is that before colonization, we were looked upon as spiritual beings. After colonization, we're looked upon as sexual beings. The thing that I experienced as that 10-year-old child was that I was forced to see a psychologist, and the psychologist was more concerned about trying to change my identity rather than really trying to help me heal from the trauma that I had already experienced. And so I'm always reminding people, and even families, I'm like, you don't directly put a child that's trying to come out into therapy. What you should be doing is that you should be helping them explore their identity. But instead, we think that there's something wrong with them. And that's not, you know, I always love to tell the story of working with an 11-year-old boy who identified as gender fluid, but also identified as a two-spirit. And so when I worked with him in helping him to sort of have the coping skills to work through his anxiety, through his depression. But what I also did was I educated him about his identity. And one of the things that I said to him was that you're going to grow up and you're going to be either a doctor, you're going to be a nurse, you're going to be a lawyer, you may be somebody who may pour water in ceremony, but what I want you to know is that you are going to play a role in your community. So at 10 years old, just helping him sort of help himself in accepting, because he was bullied so much in school, right? And so through that, he's 17 years old now. At the age that when he was finally done coming to therapy, he went back to his own tribal school and created the first gay and lesbian straight alliance within a tribal school, which is amazing because you don't see that in schools, in our tribal schools. And today at 17, he's flourishing and really has that understanding of who he is. And those are the things that we need to teach our children. We don't need to shame them for who they are, right? But again, you know, through my own healing, no one's ever going to tell me that I'm bad anymore. Nobody's ever going to tell me I'm going to go to hell. Nobody is ever going to say those things to me, because I take pride in who I am, and just understanding and learning from elders, sitting with them, learning from other individuals in our community, sharing space with them. And, you know, I just want to say this tremendous thing that Landa and her community do in San Francisco. I remember the first time I went to the Bates powwow, and I carried my tribal flag in with one of their board members by the name of Jim. And the first thing as we were walking through, and this was before COVID, I started to cry. And I started to cry because it wasn't about sadness, it was about joy. It was about love. This was the first time I was ever in a space this big with other two-spirit people. And it was just a lot of pride. So if anybody hasn't been to the Bates powwow, please go. It's amazing.
I totally agree. I have my own healing stories about Bates and how good it felt to be amongst other two-spirit people. I didn't have the benefit of living on my ancestral lands or knowing anything at all about my maternal culture. No experience at all. And I always felt like a piece was missing, and I was so deeply in, I wasn't in the closet, I was subterranean. I wasn't in the closet. I was way down deep in the ground, so you couldn't find me. And I went through many things in my life to get where I am now. And it wasn't until I started really, and my first start of healing was in that healing circle when I first got into recovery in 1970, and being amongst other members of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the 5 the 5 nations that make up the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Mi'kmaq, Amalisi, Abenaki, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, and there were members from all nations, from all of those 5 Wabanaki Confederacy nations, and many of our words were the same. And I sat in that circle and I thought I was the only one who had ever gone through what I went through, and found out everybody had the same story, and I felt less alone, but I never did. I didn't share who I was. I didn't come out to that particular group. And it wasn't until I found I'm 75 years old. I'm getting ready to start my 76th rotation. And I can tell you, there was nothing that would promote my being my authentic self, nothing that would support that. And so I really lived a totally inauthentic life for many years until I found this group in Connecticut, and we started to talk together, and to have talking circles, and to do a fire in the summertime. And it was so affirming. Other Two-Spirit people, we weren't using that term at the time. You know, thank Creator for Myra Laramie, who had that vision to that united us across. I met Two-Spirit people in Australia, and in what is now known as Australia and New Zealand, people who identified themselves as Two-Spirit. So we have relatives. I'd like to expand the definition of Turtle Island to include all our Indigenous brothers and sisters and others. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. That's my wish, but there was nothing for us in those days. So we struggled. And then when I saw these alliances and societies popping up, and I'm like, this is what I've been hoping for. This is what I've been praying for. And today, what I see those alliances and societies doing is wrapping their arms around our children. They're there to help to keep our children safe, to show them not only are you sacred, not only are you special, but we're walking with you. And you have a ton of Two-Spirit ancestors who were honored in their nations, who were considered sacred and holy and a gift from Creator to the nation. You have them walking with you too. And so we might be struggling, some of us more than others, to rise above the impact of this horrible error and what it cost us as a people. But I'm seeing more and more every day people who are rising up, and I see more and more alliances and societies popping up. I see more and more, not only acceptance, but embracing of Two-Spirit people in certain nations, not in all, but in certain nations. And it gives me hope. It gives me hope for our children, because this is where my heart lies, with our Two-Spirit children who are struggling, who are still being thrown out of the sacred circle because they want to dance in an authentic way, who are still being marginalized in their families and in their nations. It's those children that reach out to my particular heart. And that's why I still work at my advanced stage, and I hope Creator keeps me around a while longer to continue this work, because it's really important. And I so appreciate the honor of being able to be amongst this esteemed panel to talk about this in such an important topic. It's so important. And again, we're way ahead on this side of Turtle Island of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on my side, who is still struggling to add Two-Spirit stories into that narrative. So we're lali to all of you.
Wopila Tonka, definitely so much good insight from each and every one of you. We have time for one more question, and I want to also kind of acknowledge there was a question in the Q&A by Leha, and I'm going to kind of tie that into the last question as well. Leha wants to acknowledge Two-Spirit youth and what they're going through and what our communities can do to empower them as well. And so that's what their question is directed at. But I'm also going to tie that into this last question And then we're going to do a closing and the raffle. And then I'm going to end with a prayer song. So our last question, including with the insights from Leha about youth, what steps do you think our communities need to take to decolonize and understand of gender and sexuality?
Well, if we're talking about children, one of the things that I really, really stress, and I've stressed this across Indian country, across a lot of the federal agencies that I'm connected to, but one of the things that we need to do is, and I always say that our people mean well, but one of the things that we need to do is that as Indian people is create a curriculum specifically for Native foster parents of youth who identify. Because if you put a child in a home who's trying to come out, and in that home, there may be adults around them who are using homophobic slurs, that child's not going to come out. That child's going to develop more deeper mental health issues. If that child's put in a home where there may be an adult who may be and I don't even like using that language, but I'm going to use, I don't like using the word perpetrator, but just using the word child abuser, sexual child abuser. That child's going to run to the streets and become a bigger target for victimization. And so that's where a lot of my work is based on, human trafficking, sexual violence. And so what we need to do as Indian people is that we need to challenge our own biases in how we view this population. Because if we don't, we are not going to create a safe space for these young children. And really just having that deep understanding. And if you don't know, seek out, because there's people who know stories of individuals like us. Sit and have a conversation with them, learn, and just realize that, what has happened to us in many different areas as Native people is the impact of what colonization did to us. And so, I always like to talk about the stories that I hear from different tribal communities that I go into, specifically how they had ceremonies, they had celebrations when a child came out. They weren't shamed for who they were. And so those are stories that I like to hear. And I always tell people, go back and talk with your elders. If you don't know, then just open your mind to others, but also to understand that it's different in all tribal communities. It's not the same. And so, and more importantly, I don't know if a lot of you are familiar, but there were several reports that just came out. GLSEN partnered with the Center for Native American Youth. They just released a report. The Trevor Project just released a report. Native youth who identify have the highest rates of suicide. Here in Minnesota, I was part of a project with the University of Minnesota. One of the things is that our Native population is like one of the lowest in statistics population in Minnesota. 4.1%, and I may get this wrong, but 4.1% of the Native youth in Minnesota have traded sex for food and shelter. Our youth who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ, 4.8%. These are things to think about. We need to start protecting our children. We need to go back to our old ways and how we view this population. We need to challenge our own biases. And so that's my thing, that I always say to people, and I just thank the Creator. The Creator led people to help me heal. And so I'm helping others, and that's my role as a Two-Spirit person.
In answer to that question, I'd probably say, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Stop editing us out. Don't edit our life. Let it stand on its own. Stop honoring us if you can't honor our whole being. Because I've seen probably within this last year, there's been 5 different Two-Spirit people within my tribe that have been honored, and that part of their life is just missing and gone. And I think it's wrong on many reasons, but I also think that for our youth, it's important for our youth to be able to see these people who are doing powerful things that the tribe is proud of are also Two-Spirit. It's important that they see that, you know, if you are Two-Spirit, you can do powerful things. You can do other things, you know, and I think that's important. And I think lastly, one of the things that I would just like to say too is the US government has to stop trying to be a parent to Native people. You know, ever since 1819, they've tried to be a parent to us. Institutions don't have any arms. They don't have a heart. And I think that's our biggest problem, is they want to be our parent much more than our parent, you know, and I think they should stop replacing our parents and let us just be. I think it's important that when we look at the Supreme Court case that's coming up now, ICWA, that big challenge, I don't know where it's going to go, but I think that if it goes in the incorrect way, it's up to our communities to band together and really push for some sort of legislation to change that as well. I think it's important that we be active. And I think that those of us who are Two-Spirit and within our tribes, I think that it's part of our obligation to make sure that our communities are secure and that our Two-Spirit young people will grow up to respect themselves.
I so agree. I think that I'm gonna say something I hope is traditional, and something I'm gonna say is gonna be probably controversial for some. But I think that we really need to understand our history before colonization. I think that's a key. We need to listen, and I've heard elders say, and one, I just did a workshop up in Minnesota for the Great Lakes Intertribal Epidemiology Center on suicide prevention. And I snuck in Two-Spirit at the very end, and it was in a big hotel near the Mall of America, and a lot of people were staying in the hotel. And I finished my workshop, and I was sitting down. People were coming to talk to me, and I saw one of the participants come with a little child. And this woman said to me, "I wanted to introduce my child to you. My child is Two-Spirit." The child was about 9, maybe 9, had a little stuffed animal under their arm. And I was so honored that this mother had brought her child to me for a blessing. And I just gave the child a big hug, and I said, "Don't let anybody ever tell you you're not the most special child in the world." And the mother was crying, and then I started crying, of course. But it was just so powerful to see this mother, this Indigenous mother, bring their child to me, and realize that although our Two-Spirit people pre-colonial times had roles within our nations, we had specific roles. We learned both the male and the female roles, and taught them to the children, and we took care of the children. We were most known as caretakers of children. And I've heard this in this conversation the entire time. But today, we're still trying to fulfill the roles of our Two-Spirit ancestors once held. And while all of us might not be pipe carriers and lodge keepers and know our language and fulfill all of those roles, let me tell you, social work, psychology, medicine, law, anything that we do to lift our people up is medicine. We are engaging in medicine. We are engaging in trying to recreate the roles of our Two-Spirit ancestors, and many of us are doing it intentionally. There's no coincidence that many of us are in one of the helping professions: nursing, social work, psychology. We are in those professions lifting our people up still, because we know that that's what our Two-Spirit ancestors want us to do. The second thing I'm going to say, and this is controversial, but you know, those of you who are Indigenous know when you get to reach a certain age, people need to just say, okay, this is what Sadé said. I will tell you that it's been my experience in over 7 decades of life that if you have problems or challenges with somebody else's sexuality, gender identity, culture, religion, anything to do with somebody else, you probably have questions about your own. So we holding a mirror up for you, okay? So let us live, let us return to that sacred circle, because until we do, it's gonna remain broken. And that's all I'm saying about that.
Wopila Tonka. I feel this empowerment just by being in conversation with y'all. I hope folks who are hearing it is feeling that same empowerment as well. Exactly what has been said today. You know, we are reclaiming our place, and we are reclaiming our medicines, and we're acknowledging that we are healing ourselves, and we're offering that same path to others. Wopila Tonka, each and every one of you. And again, I am so grateful to the National Native American Boarding School Coalition for creating this space and by leading by example, because this is exactly what needs to be happening when it comes to all spectrums of historical trauma healing, is inviting us back into that circle, because without two-spirit people, your Changlashka is broken, your sacred circle is broken. So thank you again, each and every one of you, for sharing yourselves, for opening your vulnerability to create medicine with that. And that's exactly what happened today. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Iku, and then I will end with a prayer song after we start closing.
Chimi, Gwech, Candi, Landa, Sadé, and Lenny, that was amazing. A lot of those conversations brought tears to my eyes as a young queer Native. I thank you all for joining us, and I really hope that we get to have more conversations like this. And I'm excited for this conversation to continue. And so, just in closing, I did a quick raffle in the background of this. So the 3 winners for some swag are Veronica Martinez, Radium Wolf, and Amy Bell, and I'll follow up with you all via email. And before I hand it back over for a prayer song, which I'm so thankful, Candi, for you providing us with that. I again want to thank our panelists and everyone here who held space for them, everyone who listened and heard and took all of those words into their hearts. And I know that this was incredibly important for a lot of people, even just to hear your stories and hear your experiences that you shared. So thank you so much. And there's been a lot of great feedback. I'm going to drop into the chat a link to our website where you can find out more about the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We are asking people to call their representatives, their senators, and request that our Truth and Healing bill for a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools move forward. And if you would like to include that you think it's important that two-spirit voices are uplifted, you can always do that as well. You can find out more about that at our at the link that I will drop in our chat. And thank you so much, Chimi Gwech, and I'll hand it back over to Candi.
Thank you. I'm auxiliating. I'm burning some sage right now, sending it out to everyone who's been impacted with this beautiful medicine today, and to those who are still in need and searching for it. I'm gonna turn my camera off while I sing. I encourage everyone to just close your eyes, and if you need to shut your camera off, do that. For me, it's about just calling back my spirit in this moment, acknowledging any of the triggers that might have happened, allowing myself to understand today and absorb it in a beautiful way. And the song that I'm gonna sing is something that I usually sing in the morning, or I was taught to sing at sunrise, because this is us acknowledging the energy and the medicine, and that we're going to receive it and walk with it. So with that said, I'm gonna turn my camera off, and I'm gonna be intentional about grounding myself so I can carry this in a beautiful way, carry it forward, and continue this journey. Way higher, hey, higher, way higher, hey, higher, way higher, hey, ha, way higher, hey, ha, way you ha, yeah, you are, yeah, hey, Wakataka Ushimalayo Makakichelo Heiha Chanu Pakile Hey you ha ho yay Waye lo hey way higher hey higher way higher hey higher way higher hey ha way higher hey ha way you ha ho yay waye lo yo hey wakataka ushimalayo makakichelo hey ha chanu pakile hey you ha ho yay waye lo yo hey oh Wopila Tonka. Thank you very much.